But we begin tonight with breaking news in the special counsel's investigation into Donald Trump's efforts to try to remain in power after his 2020 election loss. Late this afternoon, the New York Times reported that federal prosecutors have questioned multiple witnesses in recent weeks, including Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, on whether Trump had privately acknowledged in the days after the 2020 election that he had lost. Jared Kushner was not the only one of Trump's closest advisors. But as MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin reminded me, other than Trump advisor Jason Miller, no one was more involved in the post-election fundraising efforts pushing the big lie than Jared. That could also mean the campaign finance angle of the investigation is also very much alive. It's the latest sign of a potential third indictment for the twice impeached, twice indicted former president, and the second coming from special counsel Jack Smith. While Smith has already brought charges against Trump for his mishandling of classified documents, as we see, he has also been hard at work on this other investigation. And from what we've been able to learn, it goes well beyond just the events of January 6th, including everything in the months leading up to the attack on the U.S. Capitol. In particular, we're also learning more about the special counsel's investigation into how Trump and his allies tried to pressure state officials to help overturn their state's election results, as well as forming the so-called alternate slates of electors in states Joe Biden won. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson is now confirming that she spoke with federal prosecutors as part of that probe back in March. She joins the Secretary of States from some of the other 2020 battleground states, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, who have either been subpoenaed or have already spoken with the special counsel's team. And there are signs that the grand jury investigating Trump's efforts are back at it in the D.C. federal courthouse. One of the special counsel's lead investigators in that case, Thomas Wyndham, was spotted entering the building this morning. He was also seen there on Tuesday. Now, as far as we can tell, no notable witnesses were spotted in the courthouse on either day, making us wonder, why else would he be there with the grand jury if no witnesses were present? If Jack Smith were to go forward with an indictment, it begs the questions. What would it look like? Well, a group of 7 former prosecutors and defense attorneys with decades of constitutional and criminal law experience laid out just that in what's called a prosecution memorandum, something federal prosecutors would prepare before bringing an indictment. It would include admissible evidence, possible charges, and legal issues. And joining me now is attorney Joshua Stanton, one of the co-authors of that model prosecution menu, and Paul Butler, former federal prosecutor, Georgetown law professor, and MSNBC legal analyst. Thank you both for being here. And I do want to start with you, Joshua. If you could just sort of walk us through, I read the introduction to the memorandum that you all created, but walk us through sort of in simple terms what this prosecution memorandum alleges and what you think can be proven by Jack Smith if he were to prosecute a case like this.
Well, we took the evidence that we found in the public record, much of which was pulled together by the January 6th committee and very helpfully released in a report, along with a whole host of supporting documents, which we looked through. Since then, there's also been quite a bit of public reporting. And so we analyzed all of that and essentially realized that probably the best case that special counsel Jack Smith could bring would be a kind of 3-act case focusing on strategies that Trump and his lawyers and lawyers for his campaign put together in order to try to overturn the election through both legal and illegal means in the court and in the White House itself. And when that failed, pushing Vice President Mike Pence to himself overturn the election in favor of Trump. And when that appeared to be failing, moving on to a 3rd act, and on January 6th itself, using his massive supporters, either bringing them there in order to actually engage in this insurrection, or a minimum, once they had moved into the White House, knowingly failing to stop this assault on the Capitol. And so in each one of those stages, there are a whole host of federal crimes that Trump and others could be charged with.
Right. And I mean, it is really, you lay it out, you all lay it out so well. And I want to big up Barbara McQuaid, who apparently inspired some of the work that you all did, and who works also with Just Security as one of the members of you all's team. But the three acts, right? So Trump knows he lost, but he doesn't want to give up power. So he sets up all these different schemes. The DOJ will make them do an investigation. We'll do these fake electors. We'll try that. And I just want to show the fake electors from one of the states. Let's just take a look at that, because this is what it kind of looked like. And there were, I think we're going to put it up right. And I think this might have been Michigan. So you had these people actually meet, Joshua. Arizona. Sorry, this is Arizona. By the way, a state that's also investigating, maybe similar to the way Georgia is doing, whether any laws were broken there. These fake elector meetings, how do they play into what you see as a potential prosecution?
Right. Well, what we understand is that there were a group of people, both in the Trump campaign as well as in the White House, chief among them, Trump, his lawyers, John Eastman and Kenneth Chesebro, who essentially orchestrated, as the evidence supports, a plan to have a kind of alternate slate of electors meet. And that alternate slate, as they described it in their memos, the concept was that they would submit certificates to Congress saying, we are the actual electors that were elected by our state in favor of Trump. Now, those certificates that they signed onto, that these alternate electors signed onto, of course, were fabricated. They were false. Biden won those states. Now, the people actually signing on to those may themselves not have fully understood the process, what they would be used for, why they were being used in that particular way. But the evidence does seem to show that at least the orchestrators of the scheme knew that they were false, knew that they would be submitted to Congress and be used in a way, in an effort to overturn a lawful election. And that violates, again, a whole host, potentially, of federal statutes.
And Paul Butler, I wonder, as a prosecutor, when you look at this and you look through this memo, it read pretty coherent, sort of cogently to me. Does it matter if Donald Trump really believed that he lost? 'Cause I just want to play you this. This is from the January 6th hearing, and this is a bunch of staffers saying, yep, he knew he lost.
So we're in the Oval, and there's a discussion going on. And the president says, I think it could have been Pompeo, but he says words to the effect of, yeah, we lost. We need to let that issue go to the next guy, meaning President Biden.
I remember maybe a week after the election was called, I popped into the Oval just to give the president the headlines and see how he was doing. And he was looking at the TV and he said, "Can you believe I lost to this effing guy?"
Mark raised it with me on the 18th. And so following that conversation, where the motorcade ride driving back to the White House, and I said, does the president really think that he lost? And he said, a lot of times he'll tell me that he lost, but he wants to keep fighting it. And he thinks that there might be enough to overturn the election, but he pretty much has acknowledged that he's lost.
If you were bringing a case like this to trial, Paul, would you need him to know he lost?
It certainly will help persuade the jury for crimes like obstruction of an official proceeding or conspiracy to defraud the United States, that he had that criminal mind state. But Joy, that's been established over and over. We just heard from Elisa Farah Griffin, who was the White House communication director. She said Trump told her days after the election, "Can you believe I lost?" Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, says Trump told him he lost that December. Trump's people filed 60 lawsuits claiming fraud in the election, and they lost 60 times. There's audio of Steve Bannon saying before the election that Trump was going to say he won, even if he really didn't. I repeat, Bannon said that before the election. So, Joy, the evidence suggests that Trump knew he lost, but he just didn't care. As far as he was concerned, losing the election didn't mean that he still couldn't be president. And that extraordinary subversion of democracy by a sitting president is exactly why Jack Smith has to prosecute this case.
Joshua, let me ask you this question. Do you talked in your report? You guys talked about assuming it's going to be a narrow prosecution. There are a lot of people who were a part of this scheme, and there are a lot of witnesses, and we can put up a whole list of them, from Mike Pence to Mark Short to Jared Kushner. You can go on and on and on. If it's a narrow prosecution, the way it was in the documents case, where it was just Waltine, Nana, and Trump, who would you say should be the most nervous about being that second guy if there's a second guy prosecuted?
Well, at a minimum, as a second guy, it's the one who shows up the most through the January 6th committee report, which is John Eastman, who drafted the memorandum, who orchestrated much of the actual electoral use of the false electoral certificates, and also the pressure campaign against Pence. Now, there's probably going to be several other people, but he's probably the one that needs to be most nervous.